This interview is a part of the Oklahoma Historical Society's Oral History Program Living Legends collection. This interview was originally conducted on the 24th of February, 1972. The interview was conducted by Mr. James Katigan, that's capital Katigan. The interviewee is Mr. W. H. Shaw, that's capital SHAW, of Tulsa, Oklahoma. This interview is being re-recorded on July the 1st, 1986 for inclusion in the permanent collections of the Oral History Program by Judith Michener.
Today, February the 24th, 1972, we have with us Mr. W. H. Shaw, who is a resident of 217 West Victoria, Tulsa, Oklahoma. 271 West Victoria in Tulsa. Mr. Shaw was born in Enid in 1895. This interview is being taken today for the Oklahoma Living Legends and the State Historical Society. Your interviewer is James Katigan. Mr. Shaw, and we know you have a valuable story to tell about the history of Oklahoma and your background. Let's start this interview by you telling us about your boyhood days.
Well, as he has told you, I was born in Enid, Oklahoma. At the time, Oklahoma that I was born, there was two Enids, North and South Enid. My father was a marshal. My father was a marshal there, and we lived in North Enid, which is hard to find now. There was a war started in Enid as to where the depot was going to be arranged. And we lived in North Enid, and my father had quite a bit of property there, like lots and little houses that people was moving into. And one night they set a fire to North Enid, and they burned it completely up. My father lost everything that he had. Right after the fire, my father sent my mother and I and two sisters to her grandfather's up in Kansas. He stayed in Enid for some time, and the railroad came through, but the depot was going to be built on the south side, and what was left on the north side, they actually sawed the wooden bridge slantways, the poles that held up the bridge, so that when the train come, the bridge would go down and the train would fall in the creek. That's in North Enid. Now, I don't remember all of this, only from my father and mother's history of conversation. My father went then to what is western Oklahoma now, in the Panhandle, up on the Cimarron, close to Kenton. It was a territory at that time, and as a boy, when he was riding a herd from Texas to Montana, he noticed that country and never forgot it. So he wanted to go back there. And he took a squatter's claim on each side of the Cimarron River. And it was in a grassy part of the river or valley, and when people drove their cattle from New Mexico into Kansas and to Colorado, he would let them graze on his land or on the territory land, but they couldn't cross the river because he owned on both sides of the river. So he cut the herd. In an early day, he was one of the old ranchers that cut the herd. I mean, he took so many cattle to let the owner of the cattle drive across the river. I grew up there in my boyhood days, but there were no schools, and my mother was greatly dissatisfied. So, shut her up.
Mr. Shaw, can you tell us about the first fence on the Black Mesa?
My father built the first fence on the Black Mesa. And I went with him with a wagon, and my mother was greatly worried because she knew there was trouble, but I didn't know anything about it. I was only a small boy. But anyway, horses detect any unusual noise or anyone coming. And I sat in the wagon holding the team with the reins, and my father was a setting post. All at once the horses looked up, and I told Father that somebody was coming. He said, "You get out of the wagon and get on this side." And I got out of the wagon and got on the side where he was at. And he took the reins and tied them around the hub of the wheel, so that if anything moved, the wheel would turn and get the lines tight so that the team wouldn't go. But he still told me, he says, "You hold on to this end of the reins." He reached over in the wagon box. My father was an expert shot. And he reached over in the wagon box and took his Winchester and put it close to him in the wagon box. When these men rolled up, which I know real well, one of them was named Albright and another one was named Woods, they asked my father, they called him Dan. They said, "What are you doing, Dan?" Dad says, "I'm building a little fence." He says, "Don't you know it's against the law to build a fence in this country?" My father answered him by saying they didn't have any law where he come from. They turned and rode away. That's all.
Mr. Shaw, describe for us your hometown and the schools in your early days and during your boyhood, about what you can remember about your hometown and your schools and your school teachers.
My mother wouldn't live over in the Black Mesa country where my father had this land on both sides of the river on account of the children didn't have any schooling. My mother taught school in Iowa in an early day, and she was even taught my father to read and write after they were married. So the time had come when we had to leave this extremely western country, which was nothing but west, and it was noted there as a really no man's land. And the country that is now Texas County was Beaver County in the territory, but we moved to Tyrone, which was not named at that time, and only a corral there, really. And my father took up a homestead of 160 acres, and finally disposed of the land back on the Cimarron River, and settled there in Tyrone, and we were one of the first settlers in that neighborhood. As far as my schooling is concerned, the girls were sent to Liberal, and some of them were sent to relatives in eastern Kansas. But I went to school in a little box and started at 9 o'clock in the morning at home. And my mother done the teaching, and it went. I had a recess, I had a noon, I had another recess, and school was out. As settlers began to come into the country, my mother then invited other children so that they would be company for me. And the first thing we knew, we had about 8 or 9 going to school in our little house. And I went to this school, or to my mother, until I was ready for school at Tyrone, which was the first school that was ever established. And I entered that school in the 5th grade. Up to the 5th grade, I had learnt from my mother at home. Now, my mother was great for fractions and arithmetic. And if I couldn't say the multiplication table forward and backward, I didn't get any dinner. And I had to read, and I read out loud. And she had a different system. We had to read with the way that the writing was paragraphed and pointed off, with commas and periods. We had to raise and lower our voice like we were talking to somebody when we were reading. And if we mispronounced a word, then we had trouble. I went to the first schoolhouse at Tyrone, Oklahoma, which is, I still have a picture at home. It was 12 by 18. And every grade went there, from the 1st grade to the 8th, one teacher. But we didn't talk out loud like they do in Mexico. We had to study. We had to study, and then when our classes come up, had to recite. Now that was carried on until I graduated out of the schools there in Tyrone. There were 3 different schoolhouses made at Tyrone that I went to. One of them was this small schoolhouse that I just told you about. Then the next one was a 4-room deal. And then the next one was a brick. And I graduated out of the brick, and it was tore down just about 2 years ago. From there I went to Goodwill, Oklahoma, which was called the Goodwill Agricultural School. And Black was the first superintendent of the school. I didn't much want to go. Mother insisted. I was quite a horseman at the time, and then I wanted to be a veterinary. And at that time, I was what we called a young cowboy. And when I went to Goodwill School, I took up manual training, which they taught then, and different subjects of school, but I still wanted to be a veterinary. And Mr. Black said that he, next year, he'd set up a little veterinarian school on horses' mouths and feet. And about that time, the Ford automobile came in, and I thought there'd be no more horses. So I quit school by only going 2 years to the Goodwill College.
Tell us something about your sisters
and brothers.
We had 2 sisters. I had 2 sisters named Nora and Cora. And my mother, as I spoke about before in this interview, was great for education. And there was no such a thing as getting in after 10 o'clock at night, regardless how big you was or how old you was. There was no such a thing as my sisters or myself counteracting my mother by sassing her or telling her that I wouldn't do this or I wouldn't do that. If I had, my ears would still be ringing, and if she couldn't do it, my father could. And that referred to both my sisters and me. Now, they both got an education and was started teaching school. My Nora taught school when she was 16 years old and rode a horse on a side saddle 8 miles, from where she boarded at a school northwest of Liberal, Kansas called Loco. My oldest sister, she taught school that my mother helped establish the district and helped build the schoolhouse, and it was called the Lemon School. It was about 8 miles northwest of Tyrone, Oklahoma. Now, the first school that we had, where we had a public school, my mother helped, and she was the instigator of getting the district cut off, and we went to school in a dugout, and it was right north of Hooker, Oklahoma, on a sand hill, and we had as many as 30 students, and we went to the 8th grade in that school. And I don't have time to tell you, but some of those, my schoolmates that went to the Sand Hill dugout, don't have to do anything but drive Cadillacs and have people work for them now. My mother was very historical. I hope sometime to have a kind of a story of her life, because she organized 4 different school districts in Beaver County, and the first where my sisters got their diploma, they had to go to Beaver, Oklahoma, from where we lived, driving a horse and buggy about 60 miles, and they stayed in a hotel that cost them $1 a day for room and board, and went to school there while they went to what they call normal school. Later, after Texas County was cut off from Beaver and the territory became a state, the headquarters of Texas County, or the county seat, is Guyman, Oklahoma, which is still the county seat. And that's about all of my mother and sisters.
Let's just get a little bit of, let's get a little on your father, and then we'll follow through.
Just put him out on there.
Then we'll do more later.
I'll give a little story about my father.
His name was?
My father's name was Damon Love Shaw. My grandfather's name was the same as mine, William Henry Shaw. My grandfather drove an ox team from Ohio to California in the gold rushing days and didn't like it. Turned around and drove the same ox team back, and I have the pictures of those ox teams in my home. Then he moved into Kansas, and they settled at a place they call Grasshopper Falls, which is still historical, but no buildings there. There's some history about Grasshopper Falls, but the town and the little town, the hotel and everything that was there is gone. Bill Heacock used to stop at my grandfather's house. He had what they called a inn or a hotel, and my father took care of Bill Heacock's horses and took good care of them. And when he wanted his horses, my dad would go and get them out of the fields or out of the prairie and bring them back in and give them to him. And when my father was 14 years old, Bill Heacock asked my grandfather if my dad could go to work for him as a hostler. And my dad went with him as a hostler and took care of Bill Heacock's horses from Kansas into Texas, and went ahead of Bill Heacock, which Bill Heacock would draw a map and tell him where to go at a certain creek or a certain fork in the river, and Dad would wait there and have something cooked and the horses rested up, so when Bill Heacock come by, he could get some beans or some whatever was in the pot and some fresh horses, and then he would go on and give my father instructions where to meet him the next time.
Mr. Shaw, where did your father go when he left Bill Heacock?
My father was down in West Texas, Central Texas, and close to where the big 101 ranch is now. And the name of the ranch was Circle Block Brand. That was a circle and a block drawn around the circle, and that was the brand that was on the cattle. And it consisted of about 3,000 head of horses and 9,000 head of longhorn cattle. My father was a hostler for Bill Heacock, and he was hired on this ranch as a hostler. Now, a hostler on a ranch in the early days is the same as a foreman nowadays on a ranch. He told the cowboys what horses to ride. He got the horses in the corral for them to ride, and he dished out the horses that done the work. And so he was hired as a hostler on the Circle Block Ranch. Now there was an English firm came in and bought the entire brand. That's the way they used to do business. They didn't buy so many cattle. They just bought the brand. Everything that was in that brand belonged to the buyer. And the bargain was that they would pay this Circle Block Ranch off for the cattle after they were delivered to Dodge City, Kansas. Now, that was a long trail. And my father, on this trail, was 3 years and 4 months. The calves that was by the cows' side when they left Texas had calves by their side when they got to Montana. And my father was 3 years and 4 months on the trail, and he was a hostler all the way, and he was a head hostler when they got to Montana and delivered the cattle.
Mr. Shaw, we understand during your early days you had quite a musical background and played for all the country dances and was very talented when it come to taking care of the dances during these early days. Will you bring us up on and give us a demonstration of this old time, old style, as we call it now, dancing?
There was a man moved in, or he was already there when we got to Tyrone with his bride. His name was Van Towner. To this day, he's 98 years old, and if I could get him seated with the champion fiddler of the world, it would be a toss-up. He was one-eyed and had a claim and a new bride, and he came out there on the homestead, and I lived not far from him. Well, he was a great fiddler, and I used to go over there and listen to him fiddle. And finally he told me, he said, "Listen, what do you want to learn to play?" And I said, "I don't know." And I had a friend that I grew up with. We were cowboys together. And his mother is bound and determined to have him learn to play a banjo. And his name was Haven Stevens. He's still living, and I visit him now once in a while. And he didn't take to the banjo, and I got me a bicycle, which is the worst thing in the world on a cow ranch, to have a bicycle. But anyway, he told me he'd trade me the banjo for the bicycle. So I told Mr. Towner that I could get a banjo, and he said, "Get it." He didn't know anything about a banjo. He was a fiddler, but he didn't know about time. So we got a chord book, and he told me how to tune it, and then the first thing you know, I was playing with him the old ragtimes never's been forgotten in the panhandle of Oklahoma at the little shacks when people were settling up the country on the claim. Now, it was altogether a different style of dancing them days than now. And the banjo that I have now is a late banjo, but I'm going to speak a little bit about banjos. There is a lot of banjo pickers, but I will say that there's no old-time banjo picker that picks alike. They pick the same tune, but they don't pick it alike. Now, I play 5-string, and I don't play bluegrass. Everybody says when I bring out my banjo, well, you're going to have a bluegrass picker. No, I'm a buffalo grass picker. Because I say buffalo grass, that's what we had in the panhandles of Oklahoma. Now, I play music on a banjo, which I will illustrate, and play you a waltz. And it don't have to be ping-pang like a tin can. I'll try to bring out a little music. So I'll turn this microphone over now and get my banjo. As I said a while ago, a banjo can be played without a ping-pang. I'm going to play a waltz that it has a Mexican timing to it. It's an old-time waltz that used to be played for dances. Now the banjo, the 5-string banjo, is a very timed instrument. I play the 5-string banjo the old-time way. Now bluegrass came in long about 30, 35, and it is a beautiful rhythm and solid picking, or they say just keeping the music coming and no hesitation. Now, the 5-string banjo played in the key of C can be brought, you can bring out the expression of your song, of your tune. And I'm going to play a couple of numbers of Swanee River. And I played it one time after a man had gambled till he was almost broke. And he asked me if I could play Swanee River. And when I got down to the final point, he began to cry. And for his appreciation to give me $125 in gold. On the old banjo. My next number on the 5-string banjo in the key of C will be Red Wing. It's an old-time number, And I believe Red Wing was written along about 1911. But it used to be an old dance number played on the fiddle, but I finally found it on the banjo, and I'll see if I can play it for you. I'm going to try listen to the Mockingbird in the old-time way of what they call fanning the banjo.
Mr. Shaw started his musical career playing for country dances in the early days. Mr. Shaw played with Spade Cooley in the late 30s and 40s. Mr. Shaw organized the Ozark Mountain Music Makers in the early 1960s, played on Today's Show in January 1964, played in Madison Square Garden in the 40s, Ozark Mountain Music Makers in the early 1960s, played on Today's Show in January 1964, played in Madison Square Garden in the 40s, won second fiddling in Jefferson City, Missouri in 1926. This was a radio contest. Mr. Shaw is now, for us, is going to demonstrate some of his old-time fiddling.
I'm going to play the routine of the waltzes and the way we started the dance in western Oklahoma when the country was settling up with claim holders. Now, there was only generally just one room large enough to dance in, and the routine was to start with a waltz, and then a two-step, and then a schottische, and then a polka. Then we got down to the old square dances, and we generally played two squares and then rested. So I'll start off with a waltz. One of the old-time waltzes I used to play, it's called Peekaboo, and it's been played for years and years, I guess 100 years old. So the next tune, after they would come out then and waltz, they always liked the two-step. A little bit faster. The two-step is a dance that they never dance now. So I'm going to play you the old tune, Preacher and the Bear, which was in a good number in those days for two-step. That kind of warmed them up a little bit, and then they'd take and change partners and get around. And then here was one that the old folks always liked to dance, and the young folks would join in and learn how. It's the shotties.
Miss Shaw, can you remember playing the most popular waltz that the younger set liked to dance by during these days?
Yes, it seemed like any time you'd start, you never would name the number that you was going to play, but the younger set and the older set was always sitting on the chairs just wondering what you was going to do. And whenever you start Over the Waves, you just notice everybody leaving their seats and everybody dancing. I'll try to play a short number of it.
Miss Shaw, during this session we've noticed that you have out of the ordinary and a peculiar way of holding your fiddle. Will you please explain to us how you come by with this position, and on with some more of your good country music?
I've been asked that question before. I guess it's just because a boy out on the prairie picking up the fiddle, he got it set the easiest way he could where he could see what he was doing. I don't put my fiddle under my chin. And another thing, I don't use my arm as in bowing up and down, in other words, reaching way over. I have a tendency to rock my fiddle on the chest and turn my fiddle instead of my bow. That's the peculiarity of W.A. Shaw Fiddler. Now, I'll play you some old square tunes. I'll play two tunes, square tunes. I'll play the 8th of January, which is one of the oldest square dances that tunes that I know of are as old. And then I'll play you Buffalo Girls. Now, I don't mean to interfere or misinform anyone, but the 8th of January was an old tune long before the Battle of New Orleans was ever wrote. And the Battle of New Orleans was copied from the tune of the 8th of January. The first tune is the 8th of January.
This is the continuation of the interview with Mr. W.H. Shaw.
The next tune will be Buffalo Girls, which is an old favorite square dance in the pioneer days.
Let's hear a polka, Mr. Shaw.
Yeah, I've got an old polka tune here. It used to be a great dance in its day. Everybody enjoyed it, and all the young folks wanted to learn it, and so I'll see if I can still play it. Shut that off.
Mr. Shaw, give us some highlights on your fiddling during your time.
Well, I just got done playing some different tunes that we played for old-time dances, and they kind of scattered around a little bit, but the dance that we started with was the waltz, and then a two-step, and then generally a polka and a schottisch. Then we settled out for maybe a couple of square dances, and then we'd take a rest and go over. Now, I forgot to tell you, in this pioneer fiddling around the country dances, that nobody smoked inside of the building. And whenever we took a little recession, why then we'd all go out and have a smoke. Now, there's some different places that I've played when I was a boy. Mr. Towner generally played the lead violin around Tyrone and in that vicinity, but remember, we went to these dances either horseback or muleback or in a wagon, or not very often with a spring wagon. And So I sprung out a little bit further after I grew up a little bit larger, and they found out that I could play, and I played in quite a different number of places. Colorado, New Mexico, and some down in the panhandle of Texas. And I played the first dance in Forgan when Forgan had the Initiative Hotel there. My wife and I went through there not long ago, 1971. The building still stands, but I thought about the first time that I played there, first dance at the opening of the hotel. Now there's a place out here in Oklahoma they call Dobie Springs. A lot of history has been written about the Dobie family, and I played in Dobie Springs, and I played in Frank Dobie's house for dances. And I knew the boys and from senior Frank Dobie and his boys, and I'm not acquainted with Frank Dobie as a nephew that writes all the books for the Dobie history or the Panhandle of Oklahoma. Now, I don't read music, and very few old-time fiddlers do. A lot of people think that maybe that everybody has to read music to play these things, but they do not. You take it at a fiddler's contest, and a man that can read music, an old-time fiddler can tell him just in a minute when he picks up his fiddle and the way he draws his bow. So, being an old-time judge of old-time fiddling, when I see a man that plays by note, I count him a professional and rule him out. And because the old-time fiddler is entirely by ear, and very few of them play the same tune in the same way.
Mr. Shaw, with your wide experience of fiddling during the olden days, you surely must have some funny stories hidden away about some of the incidents that happened during your fiddling times at dances and otherwise.
Yeah, I got one story. It's just at the edge of western Oklahoma, right on the edge of New Mexico, at a little old rock schoolhouse, and I was called over there to play, and there was only two of us that I could only get a guitar player, and the dance was going strong, and at that time we didn't have no electric lights, and we had coal oil lamps that was hung on the wall with reflectors in the back, and that done the lighting of the hall, and the fiddlers was in the corner, and I was sitting on the desk that the teacher used, and fiddling off of the desk, and the guitar player was right down underneath me. And everything was going just fine, and about 11 o'clock, the door flew open, and somebody hollered, and I was playing, and I didn't stop playing, because lots of times when you get a dance and a fight in a dance, well, you just kept playing, and they just would get the boys that was fighting outdoors as quick as possible, and the music never stopped. But this time, the fella come in the door, and he began to shoot those lights out hanging on the wall. And the one that was right over my head, he shot out, and I thought that was about time for me to quit fiddling. So I'll tell you who that fellow was. I think he's still living, but he was a young man then. His name was Giles. And they lived over on the Cimarron River in the edge of Mexico, and they were quite noted for their kind-hearted and also their tough fighting. This is another little instance at a dance, and this is western Kansas. And while I was doing all this fiddling around and playing around, and my main occupation was a cowboy. I was raised a cowboy and was a cowboy till I was 21 years old, and never took my gun off, only when I went to bed. Now, I was at Garden City taking care of some cattle and getting them ready for shipping that belonged to my father. And I went into the barber shop and spotted a banjo hanging on the wall, and I asked him who played that. Well, he said, "Can you play it?" And I said a little, and I hadn't had a hold of a banjo because I hadn't been home for a while. So I got a hold of the banjo and racked off a couple of tunes, and he just jumped up and down and said, "Boy, you're just the boy I want tonight." He says, "We're going to have a dance up here about 12 miles," and told me where it was, and he says, "I'll take the banjo, and you be sure and come." Well, I did. And the music was a gold, and the crowd was having a good time. And as I have told you before, there was no smoking in the house. Everybody had to smoke outdoors. Well, at 12 o'clock, the girls generally bought pies or cakes, and we sat around and had a little cup of coffee and eat a piece of pie or cake and had a little rest, and then we'd start over again. Well, the break had come, and we'd all had pie and cake, and then we started out with a waltz. Well, we played the waltz, and at that time there was about 4 people helping playing the music, and we played the waltz, and nobody danced. And so we thought, well, maybe nobody want to dance, so we'll try it again. So we started up with another waltz, and nobody waltzed. So I said, well, let's quit, boys, and go out and have a little smoke, and maybe they'll want to dance a little after a while. So I stepped out the door, and just as I stepped out the door, somebody hauled off and hit me on the left side of the face. I turned around to see who hit me on the left, and the fellow hit me on the right. And there was a fellow standing in front of me. I don't know yet who he was today, but I hit him as hard as I could. And I stayed on the porch, and that was the first gang fight that I'd ever contacted. There was about 15 men out there, and boys and young fellows, and every one of them was going to Fish City. And that's Garden City, Kansas, in 1911.
Mr. Shaw, I know from listening to hear you this afternoon with your fiddling and your other experiences, you certainly have a wide range of experiences in ranching. You're a cowboy, an elevator operator, car salesman, a car dealer, and transported cars. You're a contractor, and you're a deputy sheriff in Fulton County, Arkansas. So I've been told about a lot of these activities of yours. Can you elaborate on some of these a little more for us?
Well, I'm going to relate for the benefit of somebody that might be listening to this tape. I lived in the Depression time. I lived at a time when a man got $30 a month. He was what we called a top hand. Now, the reason that I've had so many different occupations and done so many things is because I grew up with my parents putting confidence in me. I had to carry responsibility. Nobody done any thinking for me except my father and mother up until the time that I was about 10 years old or 11. I left home when I was 14 years old on my own, not because I didn't get along with home, but because I wanted to go out and see the world. And I worked at anything. The first job that I was offered was a hoe handle, and I got 70 cents a day, and I took it. And while I was a hoeing, I got a job of foreman on a ranch, which I was fully capable of handling. Now, there's one thing that he didn't mention here when he was interviewing me. I'm going to elaborate on a little bit. I had the honor of putting the radar on the battleship Missouri. I was full foreman and full charge, superintendent, not foreman. And I even went to the Western Electric, and I didn't know what I was doing, but I was following the blueprint, and I engineered the making of the first radar screen that ever went on to the battleship Missouri. So you see, in moving around and doing things, if business gets tough, I say to all the young people or anybody who listens to this tape that's listening for experience, if it's tough where you're at, move over a little bit and take the first job that's offered.
We have just had an unusual interview with Mr. W.H. Shaw in the city of Tulsa, Oklahoma, at the Oklahoma Living Legend Library. On this date, Thursday, February the 24th, 1972. Your interviewer has been James Katigan for the Oklahoma Living Legends.